Can you actually make a rocket engine with things in your own kitchen? The answer is yes!
Today I'm going to go over just how you can transform some macaroni and some basic kitchen items into a pretty cool DIY rocket engine.
To build your very own macaroni engine, you'll need the following items.
A 500 milliliter jar, hammer and a nail, hot glue gun, some matches, an old medical face mask, yeast, hydrogen peroxide, and of course, some macaroni. The key to building a rocket is to control the reaction that is generated when we mix heat with a fuel and an oxidizer. In this rocket, we'll be using the macaroni as our fuel. Macaroni actually makes an excellent fuel because it is composed mostly of starch. When burned, starch is able to release a lot of energy, which is why it's good at filling you up, and also good for rocketry. But we need more than just macaroni. It's also important that our rocket has an oxidizer to initiate the combustion reaction. Of course, there's free oxygen in the air, about 20% by volume, but this isn't quite powerful enough to get the reaction we want. Instead, there's actually a way that we can create a 100% oxygen environment. This is where the hydrogen peroxide comes in. It has a chemical formula in which we have 2 hydrogens and 2 oxygens. And it turns out that if we catalyze it, the 2 hydrogens and 2 oxygens will break down into H2O, which is just water, and O2, which is pure oxygen. So if we contain a catalyzed reaction of the hydrogen peroxide, we can get a steady flow of pure oxygen, which should be perfect for our rocket. To catalyze the hydrogen peroxide, we can use every baker's favorite catalyst, yeast. I just use a simple instant rise yeast because it causes the reaction to happen quite quickly. So now that we have our fuel and oxidizer, let's talk about the setup of the engine. First, you're going to want to take the lid of your 500 milliliter jar and put a hole into it. This will act like your injector, and it should be smaller than the diameter of the hole in the pasta.
In order for the oxygen to flow through the pasta noodle, it needs to have a hole in it. And this is why we can only select pastas that have a hole, like macaroni or penne.
To make the hole in this lid, you could easily use a small nail and a hammer. Most jar lids are not too thick, so it doesn't take much effort in order to make that small hole. The next step is to connect our combustion chamber to the injector hole that was made.
What is the combustion chamber? Well, it's actually the macaroni noodle itself. The hole in the macaroni noodle serves as the location where the combustion reaction takes place, with the oxygen flowing through it and reacting with the walls of the pasta noodle.
To fasten the noodle to the jar lid, you can just use a hot glue gun. Make sure that the noodle is flush against the jar lid in order to insulate the hot glue from the combustion reaction. Otherwise, the hot glue might get too hot during the burn and stop the burn prematurely. At this point, you can proceed with the build by filling the jar up with 150 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide. The concentration of the hydrogen peroxide I used is 12%, but this would also work at lower concentrations as well. The last step is to pour in the yeast packet to initiate the reaction. Be sure to quickly put the lid back on once you've added the yeast. The reaction will start really quickly, so you'll want to start the combustion process by holding the match to the outlet of the macaroni noodle. One thing I noticed in this initial build was that the reaction was happening so quickly that the hydrogen peroxide was foaming. This foam ended up quickly traveling through the injector and stopping the combustion reaction.
So I need a way to minimize the injection of foam into the flame.
I found just a solution in some medical masks that were lying around the house. They're really good at letting air pass through them while trapping liquid contents. And of course, this is why they make good mask material. This should be perfect to stop the foam from getting through the injector. I just cut out a lid-sized piece of mask, and then when I screwed the lid back on after adding the yeast, I would put the mask between the jar and the lid. I also added a plastic separation ring in order to create the separation gap between the lid and the foam. Here are the results of the burn after adding the foam barrier. I recorded this at 60 frames per second, so feel free to adjust the playback speed to 0.25 to really get a good appreciation of what's happening. As you can see, I was able to increase the length of the burn to as long as the noodle still had material to burn. Also with the longer burn, you can see the progression of the flame front down the length of the noodle as the burn progresses, which is super cool.
Technically, the macaroni engine is a hybrid engine because it utilizes a solid fuel in the macaroni noodle and a gaseous oxidizer in the oxygen that's flowing out of the hydrogen peroxide reaction. So if you attempt this build, you can call yourself a hybrid rocket engineer.
There are lots of other noodle types that you could play with. Maybe they're even more spectacular than macaroni. Be sure to send us the results of your efforts. And remember, to expand your horizons,